I would now like to briefly introduce our panelists. So we begin with Reshma. Reshma Advani-Rojas is the Managing Director of Advanced Commercial Equipment Limited and CEO of the Odin Group of Companies, a fast-growing multinational in food service and hospitality solutions. With over 2 decades of experience in designing and outfitting restaurants, hotels, and institutions across the Caribbean and Latin America, she has built a reputation for turning complex operations into profitable, scalable systems. Known for her candid, witty style and forward-thinking approach, which, by the way, for anybody who is interested, you will get all of it on LinkedIn, where she has an amazing series of articles published. Reshma blends business strategy, design expertise, and leadership development to drive growth in emerging markets. And when she's not building companies, she's building leaders, mentoring women, founders, and executives to think bigger and move faster. Our second panelist is Captain Gerard Gouveia Jr., known to many, of course, as Captain Gerry. He is one of the leading figures shaping the future of aviation, business, and national development in Guyana. As the Director of Aviation and Security for the, is it Roy-Rama Group of Companies? I meant to ask you that, right? Roy-Rama Group of Companies, yeah. Thank you. Captain Gerry brings a dynamic combination of operational excellence, generational vision, and the public-private sector leadership to the forefront of Guyana's transformation. He currently serves as Director of Aviation and Security with the Roy-Rama Group, Chief Pilot for Roy-Rama Airways, Director, Omni Helicopters Guyana Incorporated, and of course, Chairman of the Private Sector Commission of Guyana. And as chairman of that private sector commission, he leads Guyana's foremost business advocacy body during a historic period of growth and geopolitical importance. He is a trusted voice on national security matters, aviation regulation, and regional business strategy. So we are so pleased that he has chosen to make his first appearance here with us on a CCGI forum. Our third panelist, I'm not sure that Emile is here with us as yet, because as I indicated to the panel earlier, he did indicate that he will be joining us a little bit late, but I would still want to read his profile, so when he comes in, he can just blend seamlessly into the discussion. So Emile Leiba is the president of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, the immediate former managing director of the firm Dunn Cox. He's also a former president of the Jamaica Bar Association and is the first appointed chairman of the Disabilities Tribunal. He is a member of the Board of Management of Tax Administration Jamaica, the chairman of the First Instance Tribunal of the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Commission, a director of the Planning Institute of Jamaica, and has over 23 years of experience as an attorney at law, practicing in the areas of employment law, commercial litigation, and maritime law, acting for international and local clients, appearing in the courts at all levels, including the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And if that were not enough, Emile is also a former marathon runner and a triathlete. So for anyone who thinks that their plate is too full, it helps to see how some other people are able to get that much more out of their 24 hours. And now we come to Mariano Browne, someone who really is no stranger to us at CCGI and a voice that's also valued and respected in the region. Mariano is the Chief Executive Officer of the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business at the University of the West Indies. He is also chairman of a management consultancy firm, Elida Management Services Company Limited, and is a director of several companies. He is a chartered accountant by profession and is a former government minister. He held 2 cabinet portfolios, Minister in the Ministry of Finance and Minister of Trade. He currently hosts a weekly radio program and writes a weekly column in The Guardian on topical matters in business and economics. And I have to tell you, Mariano, I do look forward to reading some of those columns sometimes because they're really, really quite thought-provoking. And also, of course, he continues to lecture at the Lockjack Global School of Business. So I want to say a very warm welcome to all of our panelists. I really can't wait to hear from all of you. So we will begin with Reshma. And Reshma, I am particularly keen to hear of how um, you are planning with your business following this January 3rd moment, and if you're willing to share, what are your 30-day, 60-day, and 90-day plan? So the virtual floor is yours for these next 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Kamla, and good morning to everyone. I'm very much going to stay in my lane because my lane is the one that gets hit first. And when the world gets nervous, we are the ones who take the brunt of it. Now, I am not a foreign policy commentator. Certainly, there are far more qualified individuals in the room. I'm just a Caribbean business operator that is running a company that depends on shipping schedules, on fuel costs, on access to US dollars. On top of which, I'm actually in the middle of a growth spurt. So the uncertainty isn't abstract, it's actual operational friction that I can measure in dollars, in days, and in delays. So when people say, geopolitical uncertainty, my mind doesn't go to the theater of it. It's plumbing, right? Like the operational side. So, what ports remain reliable? How quickly do insurance clauses change? How fast do banks tighten? Because that is our conversation for governance. Not because boards need to become political, it's the opposite. It's because volatility is now an operating condition for us. So governance is supposed to be the part of the organization that doesn't flinch when the plumbing kind of comes apart. I was lucky enough actually yesterday to attend a session at the Chamber of Commerce, and Dr. Marlene Atz, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, spoke yesterday, and she was so eloquent. She captured it better than any headline. She reminded us that in the Caribbean, risks don't arrive one at a time. There are simultaneous equations, to quote her. And energy volatility becomes fiscal pressure. Fiscal pressure becomes forex vulnerability, which then becomes higher import costs. So that chain reaction ends up in our households and on our balance sheets at the same time. But what really stuck with me was her framing of a certain phrase. She called it the black swan. So that low probability, extremely high impact event that rearranges the landscape before the quarterly report has time to dry. That's what's happening right now from our first session to now. The black swan has come to pass. And we are seeing that when you look at escalating tensions in Venezuela, and you hear a giant like ExxonMobil publicly label our neighbor as uninvestable, that is that black swan landing on our doorstep. Now, uninvestable is a heavy word, right? In my world, it's a signal that the surrounding narrative might be loud and promising, but the commercial predictability is not there. So for those of us caught up in like the concentric circles of global disputes, we can't be afford to be guided by the enthusiasm of the moment. We have to be guided by data, the data of the risk. So I didn't wait for today's panel actually to start preparing. I've already had that one issue board meeting that David Duff recommended. Because in 2026, waiting for a scheduled meeting is how you end up acting late while pretending you're acting responsibly. So in that session, in my own session, I insisted upon an exposure map that was honest enough to make people uncomfortable. It wasn't an academic risk register. It was a plain language picture of our dependencies. So if we can't say clearly where our freight, our fuel, and our forex are concentrated, we're not resilient, we're just hoping. So we look specifically at financial corridors, For example, which banks fund the trade, which insurers underwrite the shipments. Because in that volatile period, the pipe doesn't have to break for you to lose the flow. You just need one valve or one new little regulatory hurdle. So we asked if our primary corridor becomes restricted tomorrow, what's our 48-hour move? If we haven't mapped the plumbing of our money as clearly as we've mapped the plumbing of our inventory, we are exposed. But once you see that map, you get to design like second doors. So we are currently securing real alternatives for critical categories. So alternate suppliers in different jurisdictions, alternate sea lanes that avoid high-risk zones. And let's be honest, this is not glamorous. In fact, it's expensive, and you pay a little bit more for redundancy. You hold a little more inventory than like the lean model suggests. And you definitely cannot boast about it immediately on your balance sheet. In a normal year, second door looks like inefficiency. But the day a corridor becomes a headline, which it has, that redundancy becomes the best money you've ever spent. As a business owner, I'm telling my board, we are trading a little bit of margin today for the certainty of existing tomorrow. But at the same time, we are tightening our governance around compliance and reputational risk. Because when tensions rise, that financial system becomes very conservative. And this is not the moment to improvise. It is the moment to have clear documentation and decision rights so that you can move faster than the crisis. I don't want to be blocked by a company that's technically compliant, but practically blocked because we didn't anticipate that scrutiny. You know, Caribbean businesses are fantastic at coping. But, you know, we find a workaround, we call a friend, we hustle. But let us be very, very clear. Coping is a reaction. Resilience is a designed system. So if our strategy relies on last-minute heroics, then our governance is not fit for purpose. Over the next 90 days, we're moving from a defensive posture to a structural one. We aren't just looking at how to survive the specific tension. We are looking at how to transform our business to be less dependent on shaky parts of the regional landscape. So pushing for internal productivity. Costs are rising. I can't just wait. I have to improve and fix the efficiency of my own operation so I can absorb the shocks that are coming. Dr. At said something else that I've really taken to heart, and I'll quote her here, and I did get permission. She said, reform is not neutral. Readiness will decide. I love that quote. The economy ahead will make comfort expensive, but preparation will be priceless. We cannot control what major powers do. We definitely cannot control the narrative, and we cannot control when our shipping route becomes a headline. But we can control whether our governance keeps up with the reality, whether we have mapped our exposures honestly, and whether we have the kind of discipline that makes us credible to banks when the partner environment turns noisy. So I don't need to predict the exact shape of the next shock. I just need to prepare that shocks now travel faster and hit closer. So readiness is a choice you make before you are forced to make it. So I've made that choice for my business, and I'm ready for my 30, my 60, and my 90 ahead. Thank you.
That's an excellent contribution, Reshma. And I guess the idea is each business will have to have a different look based on the particular sector they're in. As you say, yours is among the very first to be hit, and therefore the kind of planning that you do would be different than, let's say, what Mariano may do at the business school. So we look forward to hearing the different perspectives. So thank you so much. Now I'd like to invite Captain Gerry, because, you know, Guyana, our neighbor, will have some similar issues to us in terms of proximity as well, and that possible migration of more Venezuelan nationals at this time. So Captain Gerry, we are very happy to have you, and I hand over the virtual floor to you for the next 8 to 10 minutes as well.
Thank you, Kamala. So my perspective is going to be a little bit different than you may expect. And to give you that context, I think it's important that you understand the seat that I'm speaking from. The Private Sector Commission is a conglomerate of all of the business support organizations and large corporate governed businesses in Guyana. So we represent every industry in Guyana across every region of Guyana, the length and breadth of it. We have thousands of members across the country in agriculture, tourism, shipping, logistics, oil and gas, energy, manufacturing, and so on. So my perspective is going to be very macroeconomics based. It's going to be very macro based in general. And I'm going to tell you what we discuss at the private sector commission level, which basically is every president of every chamber and BSO in the country sits around this table. And I actually left my camera to show you the amount of seats that are in front of me, to show you the level of engagement that we have, whether it's gold and diamond miners or manufacturers or tourism operators. So every president sat around this table and we discussed issues. We discussed how it impacts our businesses and how it impacts our supply chains. It is no stranger, or shouldn't be a strange concept to anyone in this grouping, that Venezuela has traditionally been an aggressor to Guyana. Traditionally, they have always claimed, at least since I was a child 38 years ago, that 2/3 of our country belongs to Venezuela. It is with the ICJ at the moment, and it is something that has been on the forefront of Guyana politics and regional diplomacy and economics for decades. So that being said, what it did is that it may force Guyana to create an independent system, an independent logistics network, an independent capital network, economic network, banking network, and diplomatic network that has nothing to do with Venezuela. So we're pretty isolated from Venezuela for the better part of our economic history. And certainly in the last 5 to 10 years during our economic expansion, using oil and gas as a catalyst to economically diversify further into agriculture, manufacturing, ICT, tourism, and so on. So a lot of Guyana's development and growth in the last 5 to 10 years are actually being done outside of any network or logistics plan that involves Venezuela. So with that as a backdrop, what we have decided is that whilst we've been doing that and keeping Venezuela in the periphery of our business planning, because there are times that we may get some piracy coming from Venezuela. We do get illegal, illicit trade coming from Venezuela. We do get Venezuelan Navy ships coming and floating amongst our FPSOs. So whilst it is more of a security and compliance concern, from a business standpoint, we never had much business, at least in the last 10 years, a business interaction with Venezuela. So with that as a backdrop, how we are viewing this is actually it's a positive for Guyana, because what happened on January 3rd, whilst the methodology is questionable, the outcome, at least the feedback that we've been getting from our Guyanese Venezuelan diaspora that came back to Guyana, is that it is the best thing for Venezuela. Their people are happy about it. We feel like this will open up the borders more for trade, and it'll be bringing a stabilizing force to the region. And remember, coming from Guyana's context, Venezuela has been a destabilizing force in the region for us. So we view this, again, whilst the methodology might be questionable, the outcome is favorable in the sense that with the new regime change, with US influence restarting in Venezuela, we see Venezuela as an opportunity for business, an opportunity for Guyanese businesses to really take what we have learned. Because if you think about what our economy has done in the last 10 years, it has gone from a $3 billion economy to a $30 billion economy, and it continues to grow exponentially in double-digit GDP growth per year. And last year, we actually had, for the first time in our history, our non-oil GDP outpacing GDP growth. So what that tells you is our economic diversity is growing and our supply chain requirements and networks are growing. But it also tells you that we know what it takes to restart or start an economy from relative zero and rebuild it into a regional leader in business activity, in supply chain management and in international partnerships. So we are actually positioning ourselves here in the Private Sector Commission to take those lessons learned that we did over the last 5 to 10 years and apply them in opportunities in Venezuela. We have made the partnerships with international companies in the US, in the UK, in the UAE, from China, from India, and so on. And we're building infrastructure projects. We're building education programs, healthcare systems, oil and gas supply chain management systems, and so on. And we are making Guyana that avenue for investment for these international firms. What that now it offers Guyana as a launching point to move into Venezuela because they are our land neighbor. But because we have traditionally been cut off, everything now has to be looked at as a pioneer operation. Everything that we do in Venezuela, we have to make sure that we do our proper risk analysis, that we make sure that our compliance that we have been building here in Guyana continues into Venezuela, because as you can imagine, their economy has been struggling for the few decades. The illicit trade market, the gray market, and so on has definitely been growing, and we're fighting constantly in Guyana to reduce these avenues of illicit trade. So we just have to make sure that whatever systems that we have put here in Guyana translate out into our businesses going over into Venezuela. In terms of our supply chain disruption, what Guyana has right now is actually bottlenecks of supply chain. So we cannot get enough uplift either out of the US or the UK to Guyana for our building materials, for our food supply, for our imports to keep the economy going and growing. So what we are anticipating is that, where we had dedicated providers of air and shipping uplift, we're going to see them now being split between servicing Guyana and now servicing Guyana and Venezuela. So we're anticipating that we're going to have some supply chain disruption. We're anticipating, exactly as the previous speaker said, that we have to plan our 30, 60, 90-day spreads because there's going to be disruptions. There's going to be restriction on capacity, restriction on capability that will slow down the availability. So what we have been doing is exactly as the previous speaker said, is that in Guyana, we're reaching out to different providers of shipping, different providers of logistics from different areas, because we need to increase the amount of uplift coming to Guyana, as we know it's going to be diversified. We have a human resource shortage in Guyana, so we are going to anticipate, and I know that the thought is that we're going to have a lot of Venezuelan refugees maybe coming across the border. Based on our discussions, we actually see it going the other way, that we may actually see, as Venezuela's economy starts to turn around, and I'm assuming that it turns around. As it starts to turn around, as it starts to rebuild, you're going to see a remigration of Venezuelans back to Venezuela, because a lot of them came to Guyana. They have the education, they have a lot of the skill sets, there's just no opportunities in Venezuela. So we're actually anticipating a further impact on our labor market here in Guyana. We're anticipating that we already have a labor shortage, we already have a skills shortage, and that is going to be exaggerated with losing people back to Venezuela. From the security side of it, we aren't anticipating, unless there's prolonged conflict in Venezuela, which it seems that right now they have done the conflict on the 3rd. Right now they're in negotiation phase. So it's not like a Middle East, Iraq, or Afghanistan situation where you have prolonged conflict, prolonged supply chain disruptions, prolonged closing of airspace and shipping lanes, and so on. I think, at least for us, everything is back to normal here in Guyana in terms of our airlift and our shipping. But we are anticipating in the next 90 days to 6 months a dilution of supply and a dilution of logistics supply chain into Venezuela. We did have a small disruption of economic investor confidence in Guyana, where people were uncertain of where the trajectory of the country will go, especially with, if there could be conflict in Venezuela, maybe it will bring down the price of oil to an unsustainable level. And those are the conversations that have been happening right now. I'm confidently saying that Guyana has been spending the last 5 years or so economically diversifying into agriculture, tourism, ICT, and manufacturing. So we're actually setting ourselves up so that if there's a transition or a reduction in the cost of oil, that it will not impact our economy in a detrimental way, because we're actively economically diversifying. So to sum up, I know my time is coming to an end here, but to sum up, what we see Venezuela as is actually this action from the US as a stabilizing move in the region. Again, the methodology could be questioned, but the outcome is very positive for a lot of the Venezuelan people. Guyana sees herself as uniquely positioned with rebuilding our economy in the last 10 years to use that as a model and the existing partnerships to go into Venezuela whilst maintaining a heavy watch on our risk and compliance management. And we have to prepare for a dilution of the supplies going into Guyana, which were dedicated, now being split between the two. And that is generally our 90-day to 1 year plan going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Captain Gerry. And you know what is music to my ear? When you said that last year's the report in terms of GDP was that the non-oil sector grew a lot faster than oil. That is what has eluded Trinidad and Tobago for all the decades that we've talked about diversification. So it certainly gives us some confidence to know that relations, and there are many very strong relations between Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, for instance, that your economy can withstand a lot of these shocks, which are likely to happen given the fact that there is a volatile world and you can't tell, as we move forward, what is likely to happen with the governments. So thank you so much. I appreciate that, including for all of those who were present to hear that there is a human resource shortage in Guyana, and it sounds to me like there are wonderful opportunities as well for businesses to be able to expand. And as you have heard, Captain Gerry said, sitting around the table with all the leading business leaders in Guyana, they have agreed that there will be increase in terms of needs because they see expansion between a lot of the services that previously were not offered between Guyana and Venezuela. So lots of things for us to be able to monitor and see how the region will be able to move forward. I think our president of the Jamaica Chamber has joined us. Emile, can we just do a quick check-in with you if you are able to contribute right now? Otherwise, I'll move on to Mariano.
Yes, good morning. So sorry to be late. Some time zone issues.
That's okay. I
Yes.
did explain to the panelists earlier that I really was supposed to tell you the Jamaica time as well. That was intended for our start time. So I'm happy that you've been able to join us. I did do your introduction of your profile earlier and stuff, and I'm really happy to hear this voice from Jamaica now. So if you're ready to contribute, the next 8 to 10 minutes is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say, in Jamaica, we joke that Jamaica time is 1 hour later wherever you are in the world. Because we are infamous for never starting things on the scheduled time. But we're working to change that. We're working to change that. I would say the Jamaica private sector viewpoint in respect of the current US-Venezuela scenario is caution. From the tourism standpoint, we already are currently dealing with some level of negative perception due to Hurricane Melissa in terms of us being a disaster zone and area, which some aspects of Jamaica are, but clearly not the entirety. And then that's compounded by the concerns, the regional concerns that a lot of our tourism market has, which would be based in the US, who views the region as monolithic, and simply is of the view that, there is disturbance in the Caribbean and airspace closures and things like that. And so therefore, let me avoid the Caribbean, or let me avoid parts of the Caribbean which are perceived to be in proximity and things along those lines. So for us, I'm not clear that it has as yet had a stabilizing impact. We are currently, as I said, in a state of flux in terms of our rebuilding efforts and things along those lines. That's a strong area of focus right now, both for the public and private sector. In terms of rebuilding, regrowth, we're in a scenario where a lot of our major hotels are closed for the next 9 months. And tourism, of course, is a significant income earner and has a lot of connected business areas in terms of the entities and individuals that supply those hotel properties. It also has impacts on employment. So perhaps for temporarily we may have some available employment that we can send to Ghana for a few months. To shore up the loss of the Venezuelan cohort. But certainly it is viewed perhaps what I'd say with cautious observation. For our purposes, we don't have an oil and gas industry. We are an importer of oil and not a producer. And so therefore the relative impact in terms of the Venezuelan situation from an oil and gas perspective, unless it has the net effect of increasing regional oil options and bringing down the cost, which has implications for us in our energy sector in particular, because the cost of oil is a significant portion of our overall energy costs, which is one of the higher energy costs in the region, which it also has business implications for us. But certainly at one point, Jamaica and Venezuela did in fact have an agreement regarding those supplies. So it may well be that with the administrative changes, let's call it that, in Venezuela, we may see some level of reconnection. But I would say, somewhat anecdotally, it is viewed with caution because we are certainly just not clear where things will land, kind of when the dust settles. Bearing in mind that the US is also making further statements regarding other territories within the region. So as a destination that is marketed as, relax in the sun, sea, and the sand, the disruption within the region and perceived disruption within the region and perceived instability is not ideal for us, as we are largely a service-based economy. So both in respect of the tourism sector and the business process outsourcing sectors, and so on, we don't. Now, while it is that this may have a long-term benefit, and it's difficult to say at this point, because certainly I very recently observed in the US, there was some caution by US oil and gas industries in terms of going into Venezuela and whether they will do that. And so if it is simply just a change of individual, but it results in no substantive change, then I'm not clear that it will be an overall net positive, as I said. But for now, I think there is perhaps a international or regional perception of instability that certainly from our perspective is not necessarily viewed as a positive. Long term it may be, but for now, I'm not clear that it is necessarily a positive. That would be, I think I'm within my time, if you want me to add anything further.
Sure, that's fine, because we do have room for discussion later. And I think that what you have done in terms of also given us a very broad viewed perspective coming as the president of a chamber, that overall for Jamaica, the considerations are many and slightly different, because it's not just the tensions between the US and Venezuela, but likely tension that would spread to nearby countries, and then the overall impact that has on the tourism sector, of which Jamaica depends. And it's really sad news that there continues to be, as one will expect, the ravages of Hurricane Melissa, and the fact that your hotels are really not going to be ready for several months yet to be fully open for business. So maybe ways that, again, we can find ways to strengthen within the region. I'll tell you, I'm planning to come to Jamaica next week for the Stock Exchange Conference, so we can, within the region, continue to support your country, because there's still wonderful lessons to be learned, not just in terms of the resilience with your dealing with the weather issues, but certainly your governance processes and all of that. So there's a lot more that we can talk about in time to come. At this point, though, I'd like to now invite Mariano. Mariano, we had benefited from your helping us, set the context of what we think this multipolar world is going to be like, and geopolitics and its ramifications. I have to confess that I felt soothed after your contribution last time, because I was even more worried as to what that impact was going to be. But I felt more comforted when you said, this is not going to lead to major disruptions. And to a great extent, I think although we have had these kinds of occurrences, there's a way that we cope with it personally as Trinidadians in terms of dealing with this level of challenge. But I'm really happy to have you back and to hear from you now. Now that we have had scenario one happen and there has been this conflict, what likely is the impact, and how would you guide our boardrooms in how they plan for this?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks for the referral. I almost forgot about what I said, but thank you for that. The point about it is, I think that these are early days yet, and you have to make a distinction between the short, medium, and long term. Some of all of which has been kind of mixed up, and the answer is, in the short term, we have to do some emergency mending at the level of the boardroom and the way that this could affect us. The longer term issues really are uncertain, and in terms of how it will pan out. My conversation really had to do with the impact in terms of energy resources, in terms of the region, and the likelihood in terms of the regional impact. Now, geography is what links us to Venezuela, and there are 4 or 5 areas in which you could look at this, some of which have been touched on by some of the other participants. And the first one was trade and shipping. All right. The other one is the energy sector. That certainly affects Trinidad and Guyana more than it affects anybody else in the region. The third is tourism and travel. That affects everyone. Some countries more than others, those that are in the tourism business, as Jamaica, as is the Eastern Caribbean. And then the point that was made by Mr. Leiba is very straightforward. That the level of uncertainty, we are viewed from a monolithic perspective as though we are all connected. So by definition, if there's any uncertainty in the region, it affects us all. The fourth one is finance and insurance, because by definition also, because we are regional, and it's a regional area, the sort of risk outlook that would be taken by multinational banks, finance institutions in general, will also be affected by the level of uncertainty which exists around us. And that also affects the larger picture, which is the investment climate, precisely because we are small. You're talking about a maximum number of people within the English-speaking Caribbean. And even if you extended it to, we're talking about less than 20 million people. Whilst that is about the size of Canada in terms of population, that's more concentrated than Guyana. I'm sorry, and Canada is a very resource-rich country. So, and we have to also make a distinction between the short, medium, and long term. The first thing that we have to put on the table is that the issue in Venezuela is not sorted out. Whilst the American authorities have tried to put the best spin on it and talked about a 3-phase approach. One, a framework which talks about stability and control in the first instance, then conditional recovery, and then the third, an undefined political transition. Now, the difficulty in Venezuela has always been the political framework. And as much as we talk about the bad policies of Maduro and Chavez, the reality is that American sanctions really have had a bigger impact on Venezuela than their own policies. That started off from the presumption of nationalization of the energy sector. Well, different views on where that is concerned, but by definition, the energy resources belong to Venezuela. So Venezuela has some flexibility in terms of what it does. And what I think the President Trump made the point about it's our oil is a fundamental difference in terms of the way energy sector regimes work. In the US, individuals and private sector own the oil rights. That includes under the ground. Most places in the world, including Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, England, Canada, mineral reserves are owned by the country. They're not owned by the individual company. And that probably is what led to President Trump's statement about our oil. It's based upon a mispresumption in terms of ownership. The ownership of energy resources is owned by the state in Venezuela, and it certainly is owned by the state in Trinidad and Tobago and most of the other regions that I'm familiar with. So from a fundamental point of view, in terms of outlook and orientation, some of his statements would by definition have been wrong. Now, that also speaks to the wider issue in terms of what is going to take place after. Now, extracting Maduro, because that's what it is, it extracted Maduro, but this has left everything else in place. So the real issue is that there's a lot of short-term instability here. It's not clear how this is going to set itself out. Whilst they've talked about containment and control, the immediate impact of course, on the currency side has affected Venezuela. But what we've also seen is that there's been some improvement. If you look at the reports today by Reuters, you hear that, that America is looking to seize more ships in the region, which has implication for shipping, which has implication for knock-on impact in terms of insurance and so on, which does affect the cost, which was pointed out by Reshma early on in terms of our conversation. So that's one of the impacts. There's nothing that you could do about that. That's just simply like what happens with regard to insurance costs. If there's a major disaster in North America, it affects our costs. And by definition, you will find that the shipping interests and shipping costs, insurance costs are likely to go up. All right, so that has a direct knock-on impact in the short run. And this is likely to continue for as long as the situation is unresolved in Venezuela. And why do I say the situation is unresolved? Well, if I remember, the State Department yesterday or the day before issued a notice to all American citizens in Venezuela to leave. If there was some control and political stability, you wouldn't be giving that advisory. So that advisory speaks to the fact that we're still in a very fluid state where Venezuela is concerned. Now, the knock-on impact of Venezuela's position on the energy sector is positive for most of the Caribbean. Generally speaking, all Caribbean countries are oil dependent or energy dependent, with the exception of Guyana and Trinidad. It does have an impact on Trinidad and Tobago because Delcy Rodriguez has made it abundantly clear and made a statement effectively canceling all energy contracts that existed with Trinidad. Now, that has implications not merely for Dragon, but that has implications, more importantly, for Manatee and Cochina in terms of a later context. So that has some implications in terms of the point that Reshma made from Marlene Nance that these impacts immediately feed into public sector and government debt situation and government finances. So that has a much bigger impact, I think, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago than it has anywhere else in the region. So Trinidad is in a special position, and because of its proximity, the insurance costs, the finance costs, and those issues take on a greater significance. We've always had trade with Venezuela, but low volume trade, and in very specific things. So that, for example, pomasa, which we use to make pastels, is a Venezuelan product, as is a number of other rums which you find on the shelf. But there's also uncustomed traffic in agriculture, which is not very well declared, and is also a matter in terms of something that affects the entire region. Trinidad and Tobago actually controls the Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority, actually is responsible for one of the largest blocks of air traffic control, approximately 647,000 square miles, if I'm not mistaken, from here to Mali. And that includes all flight patterns across the Caribbean. So that it had a knock-on impact, for example, over last weekend, in terms of what you would call the tourism sector, where certain flights were delayed because they didn't get clearance to fly out because of Trinidad. It was very surprising to many people to understand that Piaco controlled the routes. So that has an implication, a knock-on implication in terms of tourism and travel. But the biggest ones for us, for the entire region, is going to be finance, insurance, trade and shipping. Those are the four critical things. And the specific issues with regard to the energy sector, the global aspect of the energy sector, not particularly an issue at the moment because prices are down, which serves the Caribbean very well, as a result of which it reduces costs, right? But those other two compensating issues in terms of how they affect the travel and entertainment sector, the point that was made by Mr. Leiba with respect to the fact that we're viewed as a monolith. Anything that affects the area affects everybody, right? But that also works for uncertainty with regard to investment flows. So that's another specific area that we're going to have to wait to see how that works out. So that in the short run, things are still very fluid. We're not clear about what the situation is in Venezuela, how it's going to settle down. I'm not even clear about the political situation. No offense to Mr. Gouveia, but the reality is that the regime is still in charge. Right? And the regime mechanisms for control, the army and the Chavistas, are still in position. So we don't really know how that is going to work out or whether there's going to be any backlash. Right? The US is not likely to put boots on the ground. They don't have enough manpower in the region. 15,000 people in terms of people deployed to the region is enough. Is barely enough to garrison Caracas. Caracas is a population about 8 million. Right? So 15,000 people, 15,000 armed soldiers can't do anything except garrison parts of Caracas. So there's no intent on the American intention, no intent by America to put boots on the ground. If you look at the case in terms of what happened in Iraq, Iraq is reasonably flat. Straightforward geography. Venezuela is not. And they had to put 200,000 men in position. So this is a hybrid situation, which has never been tried before. And it has all sorts of implications with respect to international law, how this is going to work out, the ability to control the country remotely by blockading the oil. Blockading is in itself an illegal act. That's one of the reasons why during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they identified the term quarantine, which is legal, but blockades are not. So that, there's still a lot in the air, right? There's still a lot that has to be settled. So you have to take the position in the short run. You have to feel our way around and take whatever defensive measures, particularly with regard to shipping lines, supply chains, and costs that go with that. Overall, what does it mean? Well, it means that we're likely going to have to pay more because we're also import dependent. We're going to have to pay more for much of what we get because of the impact of insurance costs and certainly the question of probably shipping rates as well that are likely to go up as a result of that. So that's my short intervention on this matter.
Thank you very much, Mariano. And I think it's really important for us to take your very first counsel and at heart, which is that this is very early days and it really is unclear which direction it may go because this is truly an unprecedented matter. Therefore, it feels almost like what it did at the start of the pandemic. You're not quite sure how long this would last, which direction it may go, and therefore, how do you ensure that your business continues to be sustainable and ready when things settle? So, as you have pointed out, costs are likely to increase because we continue to import the majority of what we need in the region. And as you say, we have to see that the supply chain will be impacted and So shipping, trade, and insurance, those are, key areas that businesses need to look at. And I would think that even if your business directly does not import, you are still impacted because it is, as Reshma said, it builds a bit of at a time from the bigger picture. So thank you so much. Let me now invite all of our panelists back in. And just want to share with everyone that Captain Gerry has been called to a meeting with the minister, which would be at the top of the hour. So he will be leaving us then. So I want to therefore start with him in terms of opening the discussion. And Gerry, I know that you are speaking more at that macro level, reflecting the views of the leaders of business in your country. And Mariano has shared that it may be a bit optimistic to think that there is going to be that change that allows for better relationship with Venezuela. Therefore, and I'm not sure, so I'm stating this, I'm not sure if it is the right question to ask. So be careful as you guys answer and tell me whether or not you can. Because there is the position of business relationships that exist with China and what is happening with those relationships. So
yeah, well, so just
go ahead.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I think Mariano is right that it is very early, and I agree with him. I don't see the U.S. and I mentioned that it's not going to be an Afghanistan and Iraq situation. I think that it's going to be a lot more soft and smart power rather than a hard power. If we look at Venezuela's situation impact on Guyana, if it gets better with U.S. intervention, it becomes a positive move for Guyana businesses and Guyana opportunity. If it gets worse, it doesn't impact us any differently than it has over the last 30 years because it was horrible to begin with. We had Venezuelan refugees coming over. We had illicit trade coming over. We had Venezuela going after our 2/3 of our land, so much so having an election to elect the governor of 2/3 of Guyana's land. So the point is that it can't get much worse if the U.S., they go in, they pull out Maduro. You know what I mean? It can only, for us, the opportunity is there. We obviously are not going to be moving into Venezuela unless it stabilizes. And Mariano is 100% correct. It was very early on. And that this is why we're looking at this into the 90 plus, 6 months plus timeline, because I do think it's going to take a minute for it to stabilize and to figure itself out for sure. But to talk about the Chinese businesses, Guyana has always traditionally had a very strong relationship with China. And we have maintained a relationship with China, both diplomatically and economically, whilst building relationships with the US. So Chinese investment in Guyana is still very strong and active. We just recently completed the Barajagio Bridge across the Demerara. That was built by a Chinese company. So I don't think that the Venezuela situation has impacted our relationship with China. They still remain very strong, very engaged here in Guyana, both diplomatically and economically.
Thank you very much, Gerry. And so, Mariano, I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that as well, because is that part of what we need to consider, those relationships that currently exist, contracts with China for provision of goods and services? Because we had seen leading up to this whole situation between Venezuela and the U.S., the U.S. Imposing all these heavy fines on anybody who is importing things that's coming on a ship from China. So what would be your thoughts?
Well, the answer is yes. It's a significant issue moving forward. And this goes back to the original, the origin of the series, the question of the geopolitical links. Right? And China is the second largest trading partner with Latin America. It still buys primarily what one would call commodity items, agricultural output, soybeans in the case of example, and coffee in the case of Brazil. But it does have an interesting trading position. right? And it has been growing. And that link has also been linked to, that trading link has also followed the Belt and Road Initiative. So much so that from that perspective, I think each Caribbean island has been a beneficiary of what one would call not necessarily state finance, but some soft financing options. Every Caribbean territory has benefited from that in some way from China. Now, clearly, the new national security policy, which was articulated in November last year, they talked about spheres of influence. And clearly the US will lean on some of our Caribbean neighbors with respect to the sort of intricate arrangements that have been made from a financial position. And quite frankly, the US has not been in the business of finance. They take a private sector approach. So if you need US dollars, you need money, you have to go to a bank just like everybody else. The Chinese have actually taken a position which is much softer than that. So you would find, for example, para-government support, for example, in terms of export credit agencies, et cetera, state financing for some of the projects. So that is in the Caribbean's best interest, but not necessarily in terms of North America's wider geopolitical positioning. So there's likely to be some tension in that regard, and that's one of the things that we're going to have to look at in terms of how we treat with it, particularly for those countries which would be in direct commerce with what we call the multilateral lending agencies, in this particular case, the IMF and the IDB. Trinidad, for example, does not have an IMF program at this stage. We may have to in the very near future, depending upon the way our economy goes. And those institutions are controlled by what would the West. So there are implications in terms of what happens there. And there are implications from a trading perspective. China is one of the reasons why Venezuela started increasing oil output. For those of you who are not paying attention, Venezuela's output fell dramatically to somewhere in the region of 500,000 or 600,000 barrels. Now they're up to 1.1 million barrels a day, 1.6 million barrels a day, which is about 1/3 of their capacity. But that represents a significant improvement from where they were. It's almost a doubling. So, and that has taken place with largely from technical help and investment that has come from China. And China takes approximately 80 to 90% of Venezuela's oil output. So those seizures do affect China. Were they directed that way? Was that specific in terms of North American policy? The answer is that they didn't say that. They were seizing sanctioned ships. But if you read between the lines, you'd have to come to the conclusion that there was some intent in terms of what is going on. And in terms of the 3 reports this morning from Reuters, one of them says that they are intending to increase the number of seizures and that they were looking in terms of the legal position. And that's a Reuters report. So everybody can look that up. You can see exactly what that is. So yes, it does affect the geopolitical position, and it does have some implication in terms of our freedom of movement of individual countries. So we'll have to see how that works out. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, probably that is less so. But you have to also recognize that the government as recently as December or early January had a trade mission in China, right, seeking financing for its revitalization program. So there are implications in terms of how that works out, certainly from our perspective. Right? But Trinidad is probably the most exposed country because of its geography. We're next door, right? We probably had the biggest influx in terms of Venezuelans on the basis of percentage here. That has fallen off considerably as the situation in Venezuela has improved. People have returned home, but there's an ongoing traffic to and from, right? And that will, of course, lead to some increase in trade as well. Trade follows individuals. And once you have a larger part of your population, they will demand or accept products. But there is an opportunity for the region in terms of Venezuela. Venezuela opens up. Unfortunately, Venezuela is a lot bigger than most of us have capacities for. So, but it does represent an opportunity. Now, that's in the fullness of time. And probably more for Trinidad and Tobago because of our proximity than for anybody else. So the implication and the wider implication for me is really the level of uncertainty in terms of how this is going to play out. We do have at least 3 more years of Mr. Trump. That raises a very, a very uncertain factor, because in his statement, after the extraction of Mr. Maduro, included a veiled reference to other Caribbean leaders. All right, now that is very unsettling, because there was no names called, but they did give the implication that you either pull up your socks and move in my direction, or other things could happen. Now, that's uncertainty. Uncertainty is very different to risk. We can price risk, all right, but uncertainty is something that we never know about. And I always remember, no offense, Mr. Leiba, but in 1990, I was attempting to do a cross-border US dollar tranche for what was then Carib Cement. And no bank would price the foreign currency aspect, because if you're going to lend in US dollars, by definition, you want to make certain you get your US dollars back. So give me a forward exchange contract. Nobody would. Now, the price of the exchange rate in November was approximately 8 Jamaica dollars per US dollar. All right. And the banks were very clear. It's an uncertain, we don't know how it's going to work out. We're not going to do it. So the deal fell through. In June of the following year, the exchange rate was 20 to 1. The banks were right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. So then, if I may go to Reshma, to say, Reshma, you have to actually deal with this on a very real daily basis, because you have businesses throughout the Caribbean region and expanding into Latin America as well. So the uncertainty that Mariano has very clearly outlined for us means that we live in a world where you plan for the best, but you expect the worst. Is it, how do you then rationalize your inventory? What exactly are you importing from China, and what is the likelihood that you have to find alternative suppliers? And are there alternative suppliers, simply because to a great extent China has become the production hub for the world? And therefore, how do we navigate this uncertain period when you try to maintain as much stability with your business, not knowing in the 60-day period which direction it may go? And of course, it helps that Guyana is, one, saying they have need for human resource, and two, I really like, as Captain Gerry explained, the impact on Guyana will not be as strong as we think, for the simple reason that their country and their economy had already disengaged. So for 10 years, there was no relationship with Venezuela. That is likely to lead to a short-term havoc on their economy. So Reshma, how do you manage this with businesses throughout the region and also in Latin America with this level of uncertainty?
So I think that the conversation, particularly by my esteemed colleagues here, hasn't taken one thing into consideration, at least from the supply side, right? So I am a private institution. I'm a business, a brick and mortar business. And as such, you can't unring the bell. And that bell got rung with COVID. So the supply chain concerns we had, the restrictions on the ability to ship or move goods, the increase in overall supply chain costs has already happened to us. So if you really have an effective governance level, you should already have some things built into your system. And one of those things, 100%, is supply from China. Anybody who wants to play kind of geopolitics with private sector business is going to have a rude awakening, because at the end of the day, our responsibility is to our shareholders or to our investors. And our investors do not see red, white, and blue or anything like that. They see green, to kind of simplify it in terms of the adage for money, right? They're interested in our bottom line, in our profitability, and in our ability to survive this. So I 100% agree with quite a few things that were said in the panel. But in regards to your question, people have already started setting up shop in China. They've already moved way past using the US as the only central hub or point of command for shipping or for distribution or for anything else. Because that bell got rung with COVID. There was already a place where when we were recovering from the kind of choke points when they had LA Port was a parking lot, and you couldn't get any containers through, and the shipping rates went through the roof. People started figuring out different things. Do I ship through Louisiana or Texas? Do I come through the Panama Canal? Do I come straight from China? And many of my compatriots in business have already established these things. If you go through the page, the Yellow Pages version right now of like business contacts, you would be surprised how many shipping companies within the Caribbean region specialize in only Chinese port-to-port shipping, to the point where they're going LCL and air freight, and you could buy China like you would, in the days of COVID, when you could buy something in Seabox or WebSource and it would arrive at your door and there were no credit card limits. Those things had already come to pass. So to draw down from what many people have said, and I said actually in our first session, is that if there is not some conversation between interdependency of the islands themselves. So for instance, Mr. Leiba, I've had the pleasure of meeting you in person yet, but I've done quite a bit of work with Jamaica right now because as a compatriot in CARICOM, in spirit, if not in practice, I am extending credit to a lot of Jamaican hoteliers. Personally, I'm saying I will take the risk. The insurance money will come, don't worry. But they can't wait on those things to happen. The same in Guyana. When certain things had to be done and they tried their best, AC Marriott is a project of ours. And when we were assisting them and they were short on expertise, on skill set and so on, we drew down from other resources in other islands and made sure the Guyanese got what they needed to when they needed to. So to encapsulate everything I'm saying in regards to China and supply chains and so on, we have to kind of shake off the blinders. They're very bright and capable people within our network. I would love to be able to see us kind of rely on each other and have some sort of shared mechanism, particularly in the private sector, where we don't have to wait on kind of the movements or the machinations of politics. We can actually speak to each other, and our boards can speak to each other and say, listen, shared resources. Okay, Jamaica, what do you need? I have that. Jamaica, you know what I need? I need a 3PL warehouse that I can run out of your location to be able to sustain my Caribbean customers and bring things to them quicker. And what can we do about that? So there is so much to be said for, yes, supply from China, yes, and actually 90% of my products, just in my circumstance, are American. We are actually aligned very much with American made and American produced goods and services. But that is not the nature of what I was brought here to speak of. It's companies as a whole. It's our entire private sector region. And as a region, I think we have to start looking at interdependency and interreliance a little bit more, because CARICOM may be a political pipe dream, but it does not imply that we as private sector cannot be more transparent with each other and try to be more reliant on each other as a form of resource rather than waiting on, like I said, whatever to shake out. We can't wait on whatever is going to happen. We need to react now, and we have to have decision makers willing to step to the front and kind of take the licks a little bit and say, you know what, I think we can do this without them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Reshma. And I really appreciate that point about businesses working together and building those relationships that helps you to very directly be able to assist each other and not be waiting for that bureaucratic structure or government response, to put things in place for us. And very happy news, I think, too, for Jamaica, the ability of your business to be able to extend that credit line, to hold their hands and help them through this crisis that they are going through. And so, Emile, if you could take back to your business sector, what Reshma says she needs, which is that large warehouse that's going to help her to be more effective in being able to help businesses in Jamaica. I know, as I mentioned earlier, that Captain Gerry may need to leave us shortly, so I'd want to open the discussion to our participants as well. If you have a question, please put it in the chat so that we can address it. Especially if you have any with respect to Guyana, because we will be able to get an informed response from Captain Gerry, since he is able to sit and represent the entire business community there in Guyana. And I'm just taking a quick check at the chat. And right,
2 minutes.
Yes, we have 2 more minutes with him. So I'm not seeing any question in the chat right now, but what I can do, Captain Gerry, is then probably just ask you to give us what might be your closing thoughts in terms of what this heightened tension means for us in the region and Guyana's position.
Yeah, I think Reshma hit it on the nail on the head when she says that we have to work together as Caribbean businesses, and that's something that we're promoting heavily in Guyana. One of the big things that we're diversifying on our economic diversification push is that we have to rely on non-traditional sources of technology, people, and capital. So we're now looking, we're working closely with the Jamaica Stock Exchange Group to develop and really boost our stock exchange here in Guyana, starting with the Junior Stock Exchange. We're reaching out to the Caribbean for people who are experts in tourism. We're reaching out into the Caribbean for people who may have other shipping lines and so on. And we're really looking to collaborate as Guyanese businesses with our Caribbean brothers and sisters as a primary function. Aside from that, we're also pushing our local businesses to start thinking about supplying into the Caribbean. The 25% by 2030 initiative from CARICOM is something that we are taking very seriously here in Guyana. So we're really doubling down on our agriculture sector, agro-processing, and light manufacturing, as you're going to see that coming out in the next near future. So hopefully soon, Reshma and I might be having conversations about how do we set up supply lines between Guyana and her businesses. But I think that is the crux of the matter here, is that we have to be relatively isolated and independent as a CARICOM grouping, so that, geopolitical moves, we're insulated, we're protected as a region, similar to how they do in the EU as much as possible there. But what I would say, though, is that just, Guyana, we're pushing ahead. We're very, very bullish on our economic diversification and becoming that hub of transshipment, that hub of technology, that hub of excellence here in the region. And we're willing to work with our Caribbean brothers and sisters to make that happen. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain Gerry. And I do appreciate, that particular position about Guyana positioning itself to be able to assist the region as well, open for business with the rest of the region, but particularly being able to offer both goods and services. And of course, it's important if we are able to get agro-processing, because your shipping line, therefore, is not very far, when things do happen globally. So thank you very much. We appreciate you taking the time to join us, and we look forward to having you here with us at CCGI again sometime in the near future.
Thank you. Take care.
Yes. Thank you. And as we say goodbye to Captain Gerry, I think I saw a question in the chat. Okay, and it's one from Novak Gowandan. Novak is one of our members here at CCGI. His question is, are our boards capable of assessing risk with established frameworks? So pivoting away from the macro view, he said, should boards focus on equipping directors with this skill set? And that skill set being risk management, I imagine. So I would immediately say yes if there's a director who does not understand how to manage risk in their business. That's a huge red flag. But I guess he's asking particularly with respect to establish frameworks. So when you sit around your business table, Emile, would you like to make a go at that? Are they using existing risk management frameworks in how you assess?
Sure. Let me thank my new friend Reshma, firstly for her positive comments in relation to Jamaican businesses. Or certainly from the chamber's perspective, we are always stronger together, than we are apart. Caribbean integration has had its challenges in many ways, but we still soldier on to try and optimize the relationships as best as possible. To get back to the micro from the board perspective, so one of my kind of areas of focus is having the right policies in place, because risk assessment is not just about training. It's about, remember, boards are policy and not operational generally, right? So if it is that the board is to properly assess the risk profile of the company, you need to have the proper operational policies in place and reporting mechanisms that goes up to the board, because the board's ability to make good decisions is only as good as the quality of the information that goes up to the board, right? So the drafting the correct policies and ensuring that those policies are complied with, because I draft a lot of policies in what I do, but I've had to train people on how to use the policies that I have drafted, because uh, just presenting the policy is not enough. Just one training session is not enough. It's a culture of accountability. It's a culture of, transparency that is needed in order for the board to make the right decisions. Similarly, for the board to what I call assess national global risk and how this impacts on your company also requires that national level of information dissemination. So in Jamaica, it's the Planning Institute of Jamaica that provides these regular reports that then feeds in to the private sector. The private sector also, we do our own statistical quarterly consumer confidence and some other indices and things that feed into that information portal. But no one of us is able to sit down and intake all the volume of information that kind of keeps coming. And unfortunately to me, risk management is really what I call your best guess based on the information that is available to you at that particular time. Nobody can make decisions with certainty. What I will say, to touch on some of the earlier topics, is that our companies in Jamaica after COVID, as Reshma said, that's really was the pivot point, I think started storing more stock locally, because you do have to acknowledge that in the current environment, there may be instances where you're cut off from supply. As Caribbean islands that don't produce enough to sustain ourselves, we are all import dependent. And so in an environment of heightened risk and uncertainty, what to me, the kind of easiest decision there is to hold more stock. Now, I know companies, depending on their risk profile and fiscal status, don't always want to sink a lot of money into things that have to be warehoused and that type of thing. But the just-in-time logistics concept that existed prior to COVID, is I call less viable in the current climate of not knowing whether airspaces will be closed, not knowing if ships will be seized, not knowing if there'll be some kind of what I call disruption between the larger players that then has an effect on us. In Jamaica, Miami is hour and a half away in terms of flight. So I always say that, if the US sneezes, we have to wipe our heads, because we always have this to tiptoe between, China and the US and so on. because we have such close proximity. It wouldn't be hard to get troops from Miami into Jamaica, but we definitely are minded to work with everyone. I said we're everyone's friend. That's certainly our brand. And so we as I said, being conservative in heightened risk environments is where but there's that conflict between conservatism and growth, because growth and measurable growth tends to only happen with risk. Conservative behavior doesn't tend to channel growth, and we are looking to grow in the rebuilding process as well. But yes, for both macro and micro, it is, I think, incumbent on the larger organizations, perhaps like the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, to support those smaller organizations that may not have the internal mechanisms to, to create those policies, portfolios, environment, and so on. So you can use third-party entities to help provide you with that external support if your business doesn't have the resources to internalize it. And so that shared structure, those shared templates, things that you can use commonly between the businesses and tweak for your personal situation. But when in doubt, always consult a subject matter expert.
Very, very good, Emile. I want to say you have really touched on and, in fact, elaborated on a critical point that we have seen the need to address at CCGI, and this is the whole relationship between management and governance, and the fact that your boards do depend to a great extent on the quality of information that comes through management. And we are recognizing that a lot of management do not provide the information in the way that would inform the board for best decision-making purposes. And so that dynamics and relationship between responsibility in order that you can provide proper oversight is one of those areas that we are seeing a gap that requires us to do a fundamental amount of not just more awareness, but training. So thank you very much for raising that point. And also for tying the point as something Reshma made earlier, that, following COVID, that should have made a tremendous change in business practices. So the just-in-time concept, which was so celebrated internationally and everybody trying to do that, so you reduce cost and inventory and all that, has been replaced because it's less viable in the current climate. Now, when you consider additional cost for inventory, because you have to have for just in case, when you consider what Mariano has said and the fact that in the short term, there is an increased cost, except, as he says, for the energy prices for the other Caribbean countries other than Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, who can be more directly impacted with our energy sector. But the reality is, with the level of uncertainty, the first thing we think about is managing your cash flow and ensuring that there's viability for your business. And this, I think, is the pivotal moment of those relationships Reshma pointed to, that each business can help the other in this time, because we